Hey everyone, my name is Kyle Jensen, and I'm a professor of English on ASU's Tempe campus. In this module, we'll be discussing how leaders respond to political and historical crisis. Let's get started. By now, everyone is familiar with the poster Keep Calm and Carry On, which was published around the time England entered into World War II. It was rediscovered in a Northumberland bookstore during the 1990s and subsequently distributed across the world for commercial sale. The phrase has been attributed to Winston Churchill, then Prime Minister of England, but Churchill was not its author, and its attribution remains a mystery. Regardless of who penned the phrase, it provides an instructive example of how we can define rhetoric's relationship to leadership and crisis, particularly where symbolic analysis is concerned. Though you'll likely encounter different definitions of rhetoric within this course, in this module, let's define it as the study of how symbol systems motivate people to action. In the Keep Calm example, there are two primary symbol systems. On the one hand, you have an alphabetic system represented by the phrase, keep calm and carry on. Obviously, this phrase was designed to regulate public action in the face of impending social crisis. So, there's an audience, the British public, a rhetorical situation, the impending threat of World War II, and a purpose, to regulate action. As we will discuss in just a moment, the phrase accrued meaning by appealing to feelings, values, and beliefs that were consistent with its audience's expectations. On the other hand, the poster displays the image of a crown, which represents the British monarchy. In this case, the symbol system would be iconographic. When combined with the phrase keep calm and carry on, the crown suggests, among other things, 1. This is not the first time the country has faced crisis and prevailed. 2. The country's leadership is accordingly prepared to face whatever crisis may ensue. 3. The country's leadership will be compromised if its citizens do not comport themselves in a manner that is consistent with its leadership style and history. And 4. Nothing about the impending crisis is so terrible that daily life should be interrupted. Whoever created this poster likely reasoned that effective problem solving would increase if citizens believed that World War II was no big deal. By contrast, if they were worried about, say, product supply chains, they might increase their exposure to danger and accordingly exacerbate the problem of social management. The point is that in any crisis, leaders will attempt to persuade citizens to think, act, and feel in ways that are consistent with their purposes. So while social crisis is not the exclusive focus of rhetorical studies, it is certainly an important example of how it functions at a public scale. In order to understand how leaders use rhetoric to respond to social crisis, we need a working definition of crisis. Let's define it as an event that disrupts or threatens to disrupt prevailing ways of life for a majority of citizens. There are a couple of things to note within this definition. Though crisis destabilizes societal structures, not everyone who experiences a crisis is affected equally. For example, the current COVID-19 health crisis has affected virtually every person in the US and in other countries across the world, but people in New York City and Wuhan, China are affected differently than those, say, living in Wyoming. In order to understand how leaders use rhetoric to respond to crisis, it is important to recognize the uneven distribution of exposure and look for material indications of inequity. Consider, as a case in point, how much negative press Ellen DeGeneres has received for complaining about social distancing restrictions from her mansion. Though the stories of crisis are sometimes told as if it were a uniform event, the real-time unfolding of crisis evolves in diverse and unexpected ways. So whenever we assess the rhetoric of leaders as they respond to crisis, it is important to look for temporal indications of what can and cannot be known. For example, consider how the current COVID-19 health crisis does not have a clear resolution in sight, and how leaders respond or ask citizens to respond is determined by imperfect data about who is infected and how many people are dying. If unpredictability is characteristic of all crisis events, then we can look for different versions of the crisis as it unfolds in time in order to assess how leaders define it and redefine it. What do I mean by versions? Versions are textual variations that deviate from the original text. Though they have differences, they are all linked by common themes and purposes. Sometimes writers originate different versions, but as we will see in a moment, sometimes someone other than the author is the catalyst for different material versions circulating in the public. When tracking how leaders respond to a crisis, it is helpful to think of the text they produce as time-stamped, meaning the version is delivered at a specific time and place to a specific audience in light of specific circumstances. Doing so helps us read leadership responses with a greater sense of generosity and precision. The advantage of retrospective analysis is that more facts about the crisis event may be revealed. In many cases, we also know the outcome of the event. But such facts may not have been known at the time of the leader's speech or text. By recognizing this point, we can speculate on how difficult it might have been to lead with limited factual knowledge. We can also become attentive to what the argument relies on in the absence of factual knowledge or known outcomes. Such reliance indicates a lot about the beliefs, values, and assumptions of the leader. Do these beliefs, values, and assumptions remain consistent throughout the crisis, or do they evolve over time as material conditions change? Reading with generosity is particularly important when assessing leaders in crisis because it helps us evaluate where their arguments succeeded and where they may have failed. In order to move beyond op-ed opinion-making, we need a tactic for digging into the argument's implications. Identifying and analyzing tropes help us accomplish this work because they reveal quite a lot about an argument's unstated assumptions. A trope is a figurative use of language that gains its meaning from culture-specific contexts. An unstated assumption is a component of an argument that the audience fills in on behalf of the speaker or writer because they are familiar with its culture-specific expectations or practices. We look for unstated assumptions because they basically function as the heartbeat of an argument. You are probably familiar with the most common trope, metaphor, but not used to thinking about it as tied to the unstated assumptions of an argument. Let's say, for example, that a newspaper column described the leader's crisis strategy as under siege and/or poised for a counterattack. The use of such terms indicates an unstated assumption that political argument is, or maybe should be, about warfare. In all probability, you conceptualize argument in terms of warfare. Maybe you raise your voice to draw boundaries, threaten consequences if someone doesn't back down, or simply avoid any and all acts of verbal aggression by assuming a passive stance. The important point to remember is that there's no getting outside of tropes. Even if you said, I don't think about argument in terms of war, that does not mean your conceptualization of argument is neutral. You carry unstated assumptions about what argumentation and virtually everything else should be. Tropes give you an entry point into those unstated assumptions. I asked you to read Kenneth Burke's The Rhetoric of Hitler's Battle for this module because it is a good example of how to identify unstated assumptions via tropes. The added benefit is that it is a statement on leadership in response to a serious rhetorical crisis. Let's take a look at two important passages. The first passage appears on the first page where Burke defines the exigency for writing the essay. He explains, quote, "The appearance of Mein Kampf in unexpurgated translation has called forth far too many vandalistic comments. There are other ways of burning books than on the pyre. And the favorite method of the hasty reviewer is to deprive himself and his readers by inattention." So the crisis in this case is not only the existence of a dangerous dictator who threatens the lives of Jewish citizens across the world, but also the wide distribution of the dictator's rationale in unexpurgated form. We can deduce from Burke's argument that published reviews of Mein Kampf took a decidedly moralistic stance by condemning Hitler's rationale. From an argumentative perspective, such moral indignation has the advantage of condemning and, to a certain extent, regulating the circulation of such ideas. But Burke is concerned by such condemnation. Notice what he says. There are other ways of burning books than on the pyre, a clear reference to the Nazi practice of book burning. By referencing the Nazi practice of book burning, Burke places such reviewers in identification with the Nazis. Essentially, he is saying that their condemnation of a different cultural logic is no different than what the Nazis are doing with the Jews and others. Burke's argument sets the stage for what I believe is an important lesson about rhetorical leadership. So let's take a look at the next passage, which appears a page later. Rather than use Hitler's candor as an opportunity to promote the virtue of his political views via condemnation, Burke views the publication of Mein Kampf as an opportunity to 1. Listen to the dangerous perspective, with the goal of 2. Explaining why it is so effective, so that 3. It is possible to counteract such threats with sophistication. He writes, quote, Hitler was helpful enough to put his cards face up on the table, that we might examine his hands. Let us then, for God's sake, examine them. This book is the well of Nazi magic, crude magic, but effective. A people trained in pragmatism should want to inspect this magic. By appealing to the trope of magic, Burke argues that there is nothing special in Hitler's reasoning except that his argumentative sleights of hand, once they are studied, will appear to be just that, sleights of hand. The threat will, accordingly, be diminished, and students of Hitler's reasoning will be better prepared to develop counterarguments that respond pragmatically to his threat. Burke's appeal to pragmatism, specifically to the heritage of pragmatism in the U.S. politics, is thus very important. The point of studying Hitler's rhetoric is to prepare audiences for practical action. The first step in this process, again, is to set aside one's pieties, track Hitler's reasoning processes via listening, identify the tropes that make his argument seem magical, and thus develop tactics for counteracting it. Taking Burke's rhetorical leadership to the next level is as simple as recognizing that because crises evolve and affect countless amounts of people, there will always be competing perspectives on what is actually happening. In other words, though we would like to be able to think of textual works like Mein Kampf or, say, the Gettysburg Address as stable examples of how leaders respond to crisis, these texts, like the crises they respond to, are also multiversioned and by definition unstable. Let's consider Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. If you dig into the history of how Lincoln composed the Gettysburg Address, you'll learn almost immediately that there are multiple versions that circulate in public. Never mind the fact that there are multiple versions that Lincoln himself composed, reporters who covered his address circulated versions of it that did not correspond to what Lincoln actually said. These versions were then dispersed and even published in history books later on. The versions of Lincoln's address grew so numerous, in fact, that in 1913 the U.S. Senate adopted a joint resolution to determine which version would be inscribed on the south wall of the Lincoln Memorial that was to be built in Washington, D.C. At that time, more than 100 published versions of the address existed. The complications associated with competing textual accounts is dramatized in George Saunders' award-winning novel Lincoln in the Bardo. Though the novel is about the events leading up to the death of Lincoln's son Todd and not the Gettysburg Address, it is an instructive reminder of how social crisis places stress on human perspective and memory. Take a look at the following pages. Here, Saunders is both accumulating historical accounts and fictionalizing others in order to underscore an important point. If accounts disagree on whether or not a moon hung in the sky, a relatively simple component of the story, then the associated accounts of crisis events and what motivated them are going to be unstable as well. The task of rhetorical leaders, then, is to listen to all accounts, conflicting though they may be, because doing so allows them to negotiate competing perspectives and make judgments that account for the complexity rather than siphon it off. Our discussion about rhetoric, crisis, and leadership boils down to a simple premise that Toni Morrison captures in her 1993 Nobel address. She writes, quote, "We die, that may be the meaning of life, but we do language, that may be the measure of our lives. Whether we are rhetorical critics like Kenneth Burke, who are imploring public audiences to take a more careful look at a dictator's dangerous rhetoric, or we're the president of the U.S. charged with addressing a nation in the midst of a horrifying war, or just an everyday person negotiating a contemporary health crisis, we are always and equally tasked with doing words. I have tried to show in this lecture that doing words involves more than speaking eloquently into the void of crisis. More, it means 1. Granting a hearing to leadership stances that place us outside of our comfort zones. 2. Recognizing that there will always be competing accounts of an event because events are inherently complicated in quality. 3. Tracking the unstated assumptions that make arguments actionable via the study of tropes. 4. Fashioning arguments that are attentive to the complexities of language use. 5. Accepting the imperfections of human memory and the limits of perspective. And 6. Exhibiting a willingness to try again when, despite our best intentions, we produce consequences with our language choices that need to be redressed. Yes, our lives may be measured by how we do words. What I have tried to show you in this module is how to think about being measured as you do words. Good luck.